And now I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Michele Moore. Michele is an honorary professor at the University of Essex in health and social care. Michele's going to talk for approximately 20 minutes and there'll be an opportunity for a few questions afterwards. Okay?
Good evening, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to come and speak about this topic. I'm going to talk about how best to support children and young people who feel that they're born in the wrong body, children who are identifying as transgender or being identified as transgender. My name, as you know, is Michele Moore. By background a psychologist. I did my first degree here in Newcastle. I'm a professor of inclusive education, and I've been researching the support of gender diverse children very carefully in the United Kingdom and internationally for the past 4 or 5 years. And why I want to speak out is because I want to register disquiet at the current climate of refusal to allow any discussion of the reality of gender identity theories which leave us afraid to meet or afraid to discuss the question or discuss or ask questions about the idea that trans children are the sex that they say they are. Now, this is really very difficult for me. I have been, for many years now, the focus of a targeted campaign of harassment to stop me speaking out about this. But I think that it's really important, the more difficult it is to have a conversation, that we actually have the conversation. And I'm worried because, for example, in the last few years, the number of young girls identifying as transgender has gone up by 4,000%. And that's the figures from the Tavistock's own Gender Identity Development Service. Now, a rise of 4,000% in anything to do with children's lives, I think, needs an inquiry. And what I'm wanting to talk about is why there isn't a coherent and mutually agreed model upon which this is all being thought about. I'm very concerned that lots of what's going on in schools and medical services in relation to children who think they're transgender is based on anti-scientific claims, that there isn't proper evidence, and that we need to speak out. I do need also, though, to say that there's no contradiction between my commitment to the rights of transgender adults and my concern that we need to speak carefully about what's happening to children caught up in debates about transgenderism. But even though I'm always saying that, I'm accused of trans hatred and trans bigotry and all this kind of thing, and no platformed and book burning campaigns and all that kind of thing. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that I simply will not comply with the demands of trans activists that no one shall speak out for children on the possible harms of self-identification of gender and transitioning. And what I want to do this evening, I want to call upon you to intensify your resolve to speak out on this too, because it's so dangerous. I wrote a book with Heather Bronsco-Evans, and we challenged called Transgender Children and Young People Born in Your Own Body, and we challenged the idea in that book that there's a biological basis for transgender identity. The idea that transgender identity is an inherent biologically determined phenomena is not based on any well-established evidence. There's no medical, neuroscientific, psychological or psychiatric evidence that confirms or even suggests really that transgender identity is biological. On the other hand, it may or may not surprise you to know that there is lots of evidence that the sexed body is a biological fact. And gender is simply a set of socially desirable norms and behaviours expected for girls and boys. Gender is a socially movable phenomenon. Now, to say that, according to transgender rights activists, is apparently heretical. They say that you must agree that gender is biological and sex isn't. So I'm already confused here and thinking we need to have a conversation. But there must be apparently no debate about this, and any debate whatsoever is transphobic and hateful and must be shut down, and even my colleagues who I've worked with for 30 years suggests that I'm transphobic and hateful and must be shut down. But I simply don't agree. I think that we must have a very careful discussion about transgender ideology and its role and its influence in our children's lives, because it's teaching children that they are excluded from their own biological sex class, and in so doing it brokers bodily and psychological harms. Now, I don't disavow that some children and young people experience intense and very disabling gender dysphoria, and that loving parents will do anything to alleviate their children's distress. We know that we do that. But the consequences of promoting gender identity ideas as a truth for alleviating your child's distress and deploying ideas about gender identity in educational and clinical settings is potentially devastating and threatens lifelong harm. I'll talk about my evidence for that in a minute. The idea that a child can be born in the wrong body, that gender's biological and sex isn't, I think is doing a grave disservice to the interests of our children and young people. I want to know, in whose best interest is it that we stand silent on these matters, that we stand quietly by medical intervention on the healthy bodies of children and adolescents to correct their gender, when we know that gender doesn't reside in the body? So why are we going in on the body with gender medicine? We know also that there's no evidence for safe outcomes of those interventions that we're deploying on the bodies of healthy children. In whose best interest is it that we don't ask any questions about hormone therapies? Again, that we give children to treat a condition that doesn't reside in the biological body, when we know that one of those outcomes of hormone therapies can be infertility and sterilisation. In whose best interest is it that we ask no questions about the safety of puberty blockers as an intervention, again, for something that isn't going on in the body, when we know that puberty blockers will almost invariably lead to hormone treatments and surgeries? Do puberty blockers buy a child time to think, or do they put an already confused girl or boy onto a one-way trajectory of such biological havoc and confusion that we're actually proscribing transgender identification as a necessary outcome? And children who take puberty blockers, for example, make a decision to go on to puberty blocking treatment long time before they're mature enough or have the authentic freedom enough to really understand the implications of those decisions. So I'm really concerned about why we would be silenced and not speak about our concerns with these issues. I don't have an issue with how children want to live their gender. It really doesn't bother me, or who wants to wear what, or climb which tree, or do whatever they like. I just worry about children being put on medication that seems very extreme on the basis of the idea of self-affirmation of gender identification. If a child says they're trans, we must say they are trans and go along with this. I think the silencing of professionals and parents comprises the support we can offer children and young people, and that gender affirmation approaches are dangerous because you can't ask questions. So if you are a mother of a transgender identifying child and you want to ask, are you sure? Why are you thinking about that? That apparently is tantamount to an attempt at conversion therapy and is transphobic and intensely hateful. If you're a teacher and you want to ask a child who makes a disclosure of feeling that they might be transgender, similarly you can't ask questions without fear of sanctions. But my research is showing me that children's expression of gender diversity, gender confusions, sudden feelings of confusion about gender, or even when they say they absolutely know for certain that they are transgender, isn't an indication that the child is in the wrong body and requires gender medicine. Yeah? My research is showing that gender distress is a response to circumstances a child is finding difficult, and the affirmation of a child's identity as transgender actually makes their gender confusion worse and produces, therefore, harm. My evidence comes from three important sources. I've been talking for several years now with whistleblowers from the Tavistock, the Gender Identity Service in this country, but also in other countries, who are saying the pressures from lobby groups on what we are doing in our practice are so intense that we are obliged to work with these ideas about self-affirmation and gender identity, and we know that it's an incoherent response to the gender confusions of young children. My involvement with parents nationally and internationally, including parents in the North East, and I also worked on the social contagion and rapid onset gender dysphoria paper with Lisa Littman. So I'm not just kind of making up opinionated, bigoted stuff. I'm talking about research-led evidence. And my evidence is all that you need, really, for a gender-diverse child to be placed on an irreversible pathway to psychological and physical disintegration is for enough adults to suspend their sensible thinking about what's wrong with ideas about self-identification of gender and collude in recycling the myth that a gender-diverse child can be born in their own body. Now, you're in a bit of a bind here, because the free-flowing, unregulated claims about gender-diverse children from organisations such as Mermaid, Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, all sorts and so on, have already seeped into our public services and our schools and laid down insistence on gender affirmation, so that if you don't go along with a child who says they're trans and say, yeah, of course you're trans, then you really are in some difficulty. The influence of these lobby groups has actually taken away any capacity, training, authority or experience that we might bring to bear on other explanations for a child's confusion about their gender identity. So you may be a teacher who thinks, well, I've known Hannah since year 2, and now she's in year 12 and she's telling me she's a boy, and we've never seen any sign of that. But you have to go along with changing the child's name and pronouns if Hannah now says that Hannah's a boy, and you have to do that without involving Hannah's parents if Hannah says her parents won't agree that she's really a boy. These are some quite complicated issues for people who are working with children. You might be wary of the homophobia that's expressly embedded in your school's commitment to trans pride and all that kind of thing. But you have to suspend your own judgment about a child's expression of gender confusion for fear of being deemed transphobic and calling safeguarding procedures and other sanctions down upon yourself. Parents also have to go along with it, even when this is your child, you know your child, but if they articulate transgender identification, you are meant to go along with it. But as we all know, with gender affirmation, there's a real danger of diminishing, if we don't ask any questions, the real causes of gender distress. Yeah? The support that the child really needs can be missed if we just automatically go along with the child's self-diagnosis of being transgender. I'll give you an example. Julia, for example, a child whose family I'm involved with, had been diagnosed with anorexia at 12 years old. Just after starting her period, she started spending a lot of time on the internet, restricting food intake. She was hospitalised because she was so low in body weight. But at her eating disorders clinic, she met 2 girls identifying as transgender, and she became very close friends with both. You know what I'm going to tell you, yeah? Shortly after this, she told her doctor, I'm transgender, I don't need eating disorder treatment, I'm a boy. And in line with her self-diagnosis of being transgender at 12, she was immediately referred to the Children's Gender Identity Clinic. The Eating Disorders Clinic said they wouldn't treat her any longer because transitioning would resolve her eating disorder. And her mother and father were told, accept that she's a boy, otherwise she's going to relapse into anorexia and possibly die. And they felt that affirmation of her self-identification as transgender was wrong, and the child is now transitioning and has a difficult relationship with food, but intervention only for the gender transitioning. Or take the case of Thomas, and these young people I talk about in the next book that's coming out soon. Thomas, who in his late teens began to really experience a serious deterioration in his mental health, so that when he was in his early 20s, he was claiming to be an Indian goddess and wandering around the streets in robes and bells and this kind of thing, very confused. And his parents sought to get him psychiatric care. But a gender affirmation approach was taken, and instead of psychiatric care, Thomas was given physical reassignment surgery. After the surgery, his mental health deteriorated further. He became chronically psychotic, and the offer for this was to have more gender reassignment surgery. And in July 2017, Thomas took his own life. Or Anna, who could be from any of you Newcastle comprehensives, who suddenly decided she was trans after bullying in school. Her parents say they have no doubt that gender change is not right for Anna. We can't follow advice of gender clinicians and not attempt to process anything of the bullying. They're confused and they're saying, why are we being asked to comply with a new name, new pronouns, get testosterone into a healthy body without dealing with the year of bullying at 13 in the middle of puberty? I really think that we have to ask questions. The families feel that these intervention strategies are unconscionable and their children's real distresses are being misdiagnosed as transgender identity. And we all know that children and young people change their minds, but we have the idea of gender affirmation so locked down in our thinking within children's services and schools that what we're actually doing is freezing children into a kind of transgender identity that they can't escape, because the minute they've said it, everybody's going along with it. I think that transgender ideology and its insistence on automatic gender affirmation is destabilising the response of professionals to the care of children and young people. I think that the silencing of professionals who want to ask questions about the care of children who are confused about gender has led to the most abject dereliction of safeguarding procedures of our time, and I think we really have to speak out about it. If we don't ask questions, we're shutting down exploration of what children really might want to tell us. If we don't ask questions, we freeze the development of a young person's gender confusion. We don't offer them support, but we offer them no option but to consolidate their transgender beliefs. We're actually standing around shoring that up and almost insisting upon it. And they have very little kind of recourse to anyone, and so who might speak differently. Lots of them end up looking for support online, where there are transgender activists saying, DM me privately, talk to me, I'll support you, and so on. I think with safeguarding we have to ask ourselves really important issues, because safeguarding is being handled differently for transgender identification than any other thing that a child might come up with in school. So, you know, if they want to talk about sexual abuse or exploitation or self-harm, you would ask the child questions, but if they want to talk about being transgender, you don't ask questions. And also in relation to involvement of parents, we have a completely different thing going on in relation to transgender identity, where we're not to involve parents. And this is, the weaponisation of suicide is used here, that, you know, that we, if parents won't go along with it, then, you know, there might be a risk of suicide, and so it's best not to involve the parents in what a child is saying here. I think there are two problems with this. Insisting on a risk of suicide, for which there isn't any evidence, can actually operate as inductive. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, if you've got a child who you really think in your school is at risk of suicide, aren't you telling the parents? Don't the parents need to know? A parent's ability to protect their child is dangerously compromised if we kind of go along with these ideas that we don't go along with for anything else. At the moment, we can only affirm a child's self-diagnosis of being transgender, and I think that's really problematic. I think it's denying children their ordinary safeguarding entitlements. An amalgamation of the exclusion of parents, exposure to online influences, and prohibition of professional judgment shores up the agenda of trans activists that they should be the gatekeepers of support for the care of gender diverse children. We'll talk after the break a bit about what we're going to do. I just want to finish by talking about what will happen if we just do remain silent. while we're silent, trans activists are busy disrupting more and more the lives of children in a way that children have been young since the beginning of time. They're policing what we say and silencing those of us who want to say something different, silencing the voices of children, particularly who regret transition or who are trying to detransition. They omit to say that their preferences for transitioning children and young people involve sterilisation, lifelong reliance on unlicensed drugs, strokes, UTI, and that the transgender promise that all this intervention will change your sex is actually a lie that we are being asked to prescribe children here. There's a tweet that I saw from Helen Steele where once in the past we moved dresses from young people with penises. Now we remove the penises from young people with dresses. This is not liberation from biological constraints. This is violent oppression. Children change their mind about identity, and this trend is more serious than others because their bodies are at stake. Years later, that little one, Julia, who I have told you about with anorexia, has said to her mum, she's going on 18 now, "Mummy, they're crazy. I can't turn into a boy. I want to get my healthy body back." Well, this is all very well, but the treatments are not reversible. And so I ask you, in whose best interest is our acquiescence?
Thank you so much, Michele. We've got time for 2 or 3 questions for Michele before we sort of break out into the groups. So if anyone wants to put their hand up. Okay.
I'm Lynn Caffrey, and I'm a mother, and I'm a counsellor in Gateshead as well. And there were a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. One was about the role of professional bodies in the whole issue around trans children and the fashion that we have now for actually transitioning children, both in social work and in psychology, and whether or not we've seen things like that before in terms of practice, and how that practice years later is discredited. So what are the professional bodies saying about this type of practice at the moment? And the other question I wanted to ask you was really about Transgender Trends, the organisation, who have produced a whole range of alternative materials around a different approach to transing children, especially in education. Because I understand that recently there's been a bit of problem with the organisation, and that someone in it has said some very inappropriate things. And I don't know what those things were, and I don't know whether you do either, but my concern about it is that as a councillor in Gateshead, I got our local authority to recommend Transgender Trends approach and their publications to all of the schools in Gateshead and to our education psychology service. And if there is now a problem with what's happening with them, people are shaking their heads, that's great. But it's just that, you know, we've got children in Gateshead who we know would normally have been classified as being gay, and now we've got children who are being trans.
Yeah.
And so it's that whole thing about what are the role of the professional bodies and what about transgender.
Thank you very much.
The role of the professional bodies is very conflicted at the moment. They're nearly all in this grip of the trans activist lobbying organisations. And for example, the big counselling bodies are very much committed to the idea that self-affirmation is the thing that you should be doing. So I think people are finding it very hard to challenge within their professional bodies, but that's what we have to do. And the business about transgender trends, well, I think that's very difficult. Transgender trends have been subjected to all kinds of harassment and campaigns to discredit their work, which are not sensible. They are harassment campaigns. I think their materials are fantastic, and I would say that you can trust resources from Transgender Trend to the ends of the earth. And they talk in a much more measured, evidence-based way about ways of supporting children who are confused about gender. So please don't lose confidence in Transgender Trends.
Can I ask a question? Does this arise from the concerns about the information to do with their crowdfunder? Because there is a page on their website now that explains exactly what happened, and that it was a media person, and there wasn't the oversight of that information.
I think their information that they've sent out about what's happened and their explanation starts halfway through. Because if you don't know what the problem was in the first place,
Yeah.
So I think there's a real issue about that, how they're communicating with people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Was there another question? Somebody else?
It was just a statistical question, really. How many, my name's Wendy, how many, is there a difference in sex between who wants to transition as children? Are there more females wanting to be male than males wanting to be female? Because I think that's an interesting...
It is. I can't give you the actual statistics, but the trends are that boys wanting to transition to girls, that's little boys, yeah, and girls wanting to transition to men, that's teenage girls. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Question about the...
Hi, my name's Anya and I'm a mentor and I've been working with young people for a lot of years now. I've mentored a number of young people identifying as trans, going both ways. Has anything been done about the correlation between autism and trans? Because we've noticed where I work that a number of these people identifying as trans have those traits. The other thing that I was going to mention is we've had training, and it's called professional training by a trans activist called Tara Stone, and I've actually come into conflict with Tara in a training session, and Tara's quite assertive, would be one way to describe it. But one of the things that Tara is going in and training people who work with young people is that the process for transitioning should be sped up and be much, much quicker and be enabled much, much younger. Now, I'm the mother of, and that work is 19 now, but as the mother of a teenager and as someone who works with young people, I know full well that they can identify in a particular way, they take on characteristics, it's part of growing up. And it frightens me that decisions are being made very early that are irreversible.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're working with organisations of parents in Scandinavian countries and in Canada where there's a real rush to begin all the gender medical interventions much earlier, and that is catching hold here. It's something to be terribly worried about. The issue of consent for children and young people here is absolutely immense. How children and young people can give consent to these surgeries before they even understand anything about sex or sexuality. Diagnosis of gender dysphoria in adolescence is a very difficult thing because gender identity and feelings about sexual orientation change during the period of adolescence. The whole thing requires a great deal more research.
Thanks. Ravina, what's the incidence per head of population of people, of babies who are born with both sex organs, both male and female?
Yeah, it's, I can't tell you exactly, but it's tiny. And children with intersex conditions are not part of this transgender group. Children with intersex conditions have developmental and physical disorders, whereas transgender identity is an identity. There's nothing different in the body of a transgender child. Yeah.
one more question at the back
Thank
there.
you.
Yeah.
I think it's been really important discussion. I just wanted to talk about the role of popular culture. I'm not going to admit to watching Designated Survivor, but I caught up with it the other night, and I was really struck. It's got a huge bit in it about transgender, and the one bit with the woman in it is negative. She's presented as aggressive, and the whole thing is, if you're progressive, then you're going to be with the transgender. And I think popular culture, we've got to take hold of it. We've really got to take hold of it. I mean, if you look at the aesthetic of working class stuff, the working class are always presented as bad, mad or ugly.
Yeah.
And here we've got it with women in exactly the same position. So we've got to take hold of popular culture.
Yes, you're right. This whole thing's been sold as if it's progressive and
Yeah,
liberal,
yeah.
but it's completely the opposite. It's
Exactly.
regressive and illiberal and dangerous. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to sort of move on. We're slightly behind in time, but I think another round of applause for.